Hello and welcome to today's webinar by the AM Academy. My name is Sven, and today I want to talk about material storage for FFF printing. My example printer today is the new Raise 3D Pro 3, but what I'll say pretty much applies to any filament 3D printer out there. Now, when talking about storage, there's really two cases where storage is necessary. The first case is during the print. I need to store my material somewhere so it goes into the printer. In the Pro 3's case, there's a door on the side, and then there's little hangers on the inside where the filament goes. But on many other printers, there's simply a holder on the outside of the machine that you hang the spool onto, or in the more expensive machines, you might have proper filament chambers, potentially even humidity controlled or heated or dried or whatever. In any case, that's an attempt to optimize the storage conditions. And the second case where you need to store your material is when it's not in use. Say you've got a red, yellow, green, and blue filament, and you're printing with green and blue, then yellow and red need to be stored somewhere. And this storage is important so that your material doesn't degrade, doesn't get worse over time. So the storage is relevant to your print results. And that's what I want to talk about today. The first thing I want to say is that some materials, especially ABS or some other ones, degrade significantly when exposed to UV light for an extended period of time. So try to keep your materials out of direct sunlight. Find a shady spot for them, a shaded spot for them, and then keep them there and don't put them in the direct sunlight unless you really have to. So that's step one, keep them away from UV light. And step two is keep them dry. And this step two is what I'll mostly focus on for the rest of today, because that's the more complex one and the one that's more interesting, to me at least anyway. Now, when talking about humidity and wet filament, the trick is that the humidity that is in the air around us will actually be absorbed by the plastic filaments. And this happens almost no matter what filament you're using, although some are more susceptible to this than others. PLA, for example, it's not really that big of a problem. The rate at which it absorbs moisture from the air and the total moisture content of the filament, even if exposed for a prolonged period of time, is not that high. On the other hand, you'll have filaments such as nylon, PA12, or even PA6, that are extremely hygroscopic, as we call this property of absorbing moisture from the air. The more hygroscopic a material is, the faster and the more water it absorbs. So PA6, for example, is extremely hygroscopic and will degrade massively if exposed to the open air for as little as 30 minutes. So this is something you need to be very wary of depending on what material you're using. If you're just a hobbyist using PLA, don't worry about this as much. It doesn't really apply to you unless you want to print with PVA or BVOH, which are soluble, water-soluble support materials. Those obviously have to be kept dry, otherwise you'll run into issues. Now, a wet filament is not something you will be able to feel. It's not going to feel wet on the outside, leave moisture on your fingers, but there will still be moisture inside. So the trick is that within this thread of filament, on the inside, there's tiny, tiny water bubbles throughout the entire thread, so to speak. And that may not seem like a problem at first glance, but when you then put it into the printer and print with it, letting it go to the hot end, and what happens in the hot end? It melts the plastic. Now in this case it's PLA, so about 205 degrees Celsius. There's water in my plastic. What happens if I heat that to 205 degrees Celsius, or try to? It'll start boiling, and that water will start turning into water vapor, it's steam. And that steam expands, obviously, because it's got more volume than simple water. And that will lead to gaps being created in the outer walls of my part, because at certain points, at certain times, instead of plastic coming out of the nozzle, there will be a steam bubble. And that will not be plastic, but the printed will keep moving. So the wetter your filament, the more holes you'll have in your part. There's also other surface defects, such as orange skin, which is a really rough outer surface, or excessive stringing that can come from wet filament. So if you see a lot of these or have a lot of issues with that kind of thing, keep in mind it might be due to wet filament. But if it gets really bad, say you dropped your filament into a bucket of water, I don't know how, but say you did, then it's possible that this steam can get superheated inside, or that's a property. Let me rewind. Steam has a property that it can be superheated, meaning that even though it's already turned into steam, it can absorb more heat energy. And if that happens, and if there's too much steam inside and it absorbs all the heat energy from the hot end, it's possible that it'll absorb so much that there's not enough heat to melt the plastic anymore. And then you will definitely not just have a bad print, but a failed print, because at that point, no more plastic will come out of the nozzle, because it's not being melted. So that can really lead to a lot of issues. So what have we learned? We want to avoid UV light, and we want to avoid wet filament. But how do we do this? How do we avoid our filament from getting wet? Well, we place it into a humidity-controlled environment. And that's why I mentioned some of the higher-end printers might have temperature and humidity-controlled storage boxes or compartments for the filament spools to go into. If you don't have something like that, there's a third-party solution. Either the Pulley Box from Pulley Maker, which I have right here, and I'll unpack that in a second, or you build your own. There's plenty of instruction manuals out there to build dry boxes from IKEA materials, from anything else you can find out there. Just go and have a quick Google search. But for now, I'll stick with a more professional approach with a Pulley Box by Pulley Maker, and I'll just unpack this here so we can have a look at how this works, what it does, and how to use it. So that's it. I'll put the cardboard away, then I'll take the styrofoam off, put that away as well. And this is my Pulley Box. The basic approach is very straightforward and simple. It's just a closed box. And then on the inside, you place silicates. Silicates are a material that absorb moisture from the air, just like our plastic, but faster and better. And that's exactly the trick. We'll place these silicates inside the box with our filament, put the lid on top, and that'll guarantee that our filament doesn't absorb the moisture, because that's all being absorbed by the silicates. And because the whole thing is enclosed, very little air exchange will happen unless you constantly take the lid off. And that will allow us to keep a stable environment on the inside of this Pulley Box. So there's a little accessory box, and inside there's silicates. Keep in mind there's different kinds of these. There are some that are reusable that you can dry and then reuse, and there are some that are single use. Once they've soaked up water, you have to throw them away and completely replace them. But silicates are in here. There's a tube, I'll get to that later, and there's ball bearings and little rods. Now these are important because, well, when printing, we want the spool to unwind without any difficulties. So as little friction as possible, and that's what these are for. They go into these little slots inside the box. Gotta get the second one. And basically there's space for two 1 kilogram, up to 1 kilogram spools inside this Pulley Box. So now I would place my filament spool inside, and then thread the end of the filament through the little rubber grommet that is on the front, or through one of the rubber grommets that would be on the top of the box. For now, I'll go with the front. Put this aside. And now I can just unroll my filament by pulling on the end of the filament. You can see here how this works with the two little rods and the ball bearings. Moving my whole table around. And there's one more trick to this box, and that's a humidity and temperature sensor on the back. So using this from the outside, you will always be able to see what the current humidity is on the inside of this dry box. So I would chuck these two things in there, and then I would close the lid. And now it's ready to use without me having to worry about this filament getting any wetter than it currently is. Take note, this doesn't dry the filament. It keeps it at its current state, okay? So if I put a dry filament inside, it'll stay mostly dry. And then I would put that next to my printer and thread the filament. In this case, I don't have to open the door because there's little rubber grommets on the bottom of the printer door as well. Here, I can rotate it real quick so you can see that. So there's little rubber grommets here. And I can just thread my filament through that and into the printer. And if I now wanted to be real cute and didn't even want to allow this stretch of air to affect my material, then I would use a tube like this one to bridge the distance between printer and my dry box, keeping the filament dry at all times. So when you get a new spool of material, that is why they're always sealed airtight in a bag like this, so that no moisture can get in, and so that when you unpack your material, you can actually start printing and don't have to dry your material first. Speaking of drying, once your material has gotten wet, say you dropped it in a bucket or you left it out in the open air for months on end, your filament does not have to be thrown away. It is not broken per se. You can re-dry a wet filament. And to do this, it has to be placed in an oven. There are special drying ovens for 3D printing filaments, but you can just do that with your home oven as well. Simply prop the door open a tiny bit with a ladle or spoon and set the temperature to a certain value for a certain amount of time. This value and this time depend on the material you're trying to dry. There are manufacturer recommendations out there or some sort of overviews on the internet. Simply Google that for now. I don't want to give any concrete recommendations because they can vary from material to material, but say 65 degrees for 8 hours. Something like that. And after that, because the warmth will make the humidity leave the filament and then the wet air can escape, that's why you prop open the oven door, my filament will be dry again. One note though, sometimes, for some filaments, especially the more technical ones, it's possible that the filament says, I want to be dried at a certain temperature, and that temperature is too high for the spool material. So this plastic out here, it'll be perfect for the filament, but it'll be too hot for this, and this will melt or deform. And that's something you really have to pay attention to. It's happened to us multiple times already that we wanted to dry filament, accepted the manufacturer recommendations, but the spool material got soft and then we had a big mess. So make sure you pay attention to that as well, just as a little aside. Learn from our mistakes, don't make them yourself. Okay, so the two things we want to do with material storage is keep them out of direct sunlight and keep them dry as much as we can. And if we cannot keep them dry, we should dry them in an oven before returning them to use in our 3D printer. Yeah? And it differs from material to material how much of an issue this is. Not a big threat for PLA, but a massive threat for PA6, for example. And then everything in between will be somewhere on a scale in between not a worry and an extreme worry. So try and figure out what material you have and ask the internet for help on how to store your material and how to dry it, for how long, at what temperatures. And yeah, that's all I wanted to show and talk about today. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I answered any questions you may have had. If I did leave any questions unanswered, please leave them below the video. I'll do my best to answer them all. And other than that, thank you very much for watching. Have a great day, and I hope I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.